So when I just kind of took a step back and realized, well, look at the context. What did Paul just criticize in verse 3? What are these false teachers teaching? What are some of the false things that are coming out in their doctrines and teachings? And he says, number one, and this wasn't all of it, but this is a couple things that they mentioned: forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats. And so in a figurative sense, and it's still true to the text, but bodily exercise can mean these outward forms of discipline for some sort of moral reform, kind of a religious asceticism. Asceticism is the severe or extreme self-discipline of your body, abstaining from bodily impulses or certain pleasures, or things like, to put it, kind of simply put, fasting from food, like they say right here, abstaining from meats, or denying certain pleasures, or abstaining from this thing or that thing. And these false teachers were teaching, as we can see in verse 3, they were forbidding marriage. And an aspect of marriage, a unique aspect of marriage, is physical intimacy that one can enjoy. But they were saying that it's not good to yield to that bodily impulse. We need to abstain from that, and therefore, it's probably best to abstain from marriage as a whole. Furthermore, you should abstain from certain foods. And these foods satisfy our bellies, and you should deny that bodily impulse to eat or consume or whatever it was that they were specifically teaching against. And so I think this bodily exercise that Paul is saying has a little bit of profit, but is really kind of missing the mark, is really this religious asceticism. But one thing I want to further, again, before we get into this inward exercise, is why were people listening to these false teachers? How are they gaining an audience? Why is it that they had any influence or sway over those to whom they were speaking? And if you think of the word deceptive means it's deceiving you. You're believing something, but it's not true. And why are you believing that? Oftentimes, there's just enough of truth mixed in to sound convincing. And so when I looked at this from that perspective, I started to evaluate, well, what else did Paul say? Maybe consulting some of his other letters. What were these false teachers leveraging? I mean, Paul was a well-known apostle at this time. He's written a number of letters. He's traveled all around. I think a lot of people know the Apostle Paul. And so maybe these false teachers were even quoting Paul, or maybe misconstruing some of his words. Consider what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7. Was Paul against marriage? I don't know. Let's read 1 Corinthians 7, specifically verses 32 and 33. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord. That sounds noble, right? He who is unmarried, the person who is single, who practices celibacy, etc., he who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. That sounds noble. I'll give them a check mark, a good point on that, remaining single. Verse 33, in contrast, but he who is married cares for things about the world, how he may please his wife. That sounds worldly. That sounds bad. Paul, are you against marriage? Are you forbidding marriage? I can easily see how one could kind of quote Paul or maybe use some of Paul's teachings and completely misconstrue them. And I think that's what these false teachers were doing. Think of this. Did Paul advocate asceticism? 1 Corinthians 9:27 again. But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection. That sounds very much like some sort of religious asceticism. And so I'm kind of guessing here, and I think it's a pretty good guess, that these false teachers were saying, look, even Paul is teaching these same things. We're aligned with Paul. But the thing was, they started pushing it, and they pushed it to the nth degree. And so what Paul is doing here, I think in verses 7 and 8, and the rest of this chapter, is he's walking this fine line of discernment. He acknowledges in verse 8 that this bodily exercise, this asceticism, does profit. It profits a little bit. He acknowledges that these outward bodily disciplines do actually help. And if you think about it, it does help to abstain from certain things for a period of time to maybe reevaluate your priorities. Maybe you've slipped into a bad habit. Maybe you've just started, or maybe you've lost a good habit because of something else kind of overwhelming you. And it's good to take a break, to abstain from this thing or to abstain from that thing, or maybe to fast from foods and use that bodily impulse as a reminder to pray for someone or pray for something or to dedicate this time to God. It's good to do those things. It's encouraged throughout the scripture. There's plenty of examples of it. But this is, I think, the point of discernment that Paul is trying to bring out here. If that kind of abstinence or fasting or denying becomes your religion, like these false teachers, you start to miss the whole point. Consider the end lesson of what these false teachers were teaching. They were ultimately forbidding marriage. Marriage, that was God's idea, established from the beginning, reiterated and affirmed throughout Scripture until the very end, as a picture of Christ in the church. And these guys are starting to forbid marriage, completely missing the mark, completely destroying a beautiful institution ordained by God to represent Christ in the church and to be enjoyed by a husband and wife. And they're denying certain foods that as Paul kind of rebuts, he says that God created for the enjoyment, and in response, thanking God as the giver of all good gifts. And so what happens is these false teachers were taking, I think, some probably the culture of the day, some of what Paul's teaching, some just kind of mixing things together and coming up with this religious asceticism and taking it to the nth degree, and it became this degenerate form of religion that ultimately, when you think about it, it replaces God as the focus with us as the focus. Maybe these teachings sounded good at first, but they pushed it to a point, and the true source was exposed, as we can see in verses 1 and 2. They were deceiving spirits, doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. They were not interested in the truth. They were not interested in true worship of God. Now, in contrast to these outward forms of discipline, yes, Paul acknowledges that there's some benefit to them. But he highlights this inward exercise, and that's what I want to focus on this morning, this inward exercise, as he says, toward godliness in verse 7. This inward exercise of godliness that will produce outward results. And just a couple definitions, I think, to help us understand godliness. I've definitely quoted this before. It's a good book, The Practice of Godliness by Jerry Bridges. I think we went through it during our midweek Bible study a number of years ago. But Jerry Bridges defines godliness as this, quote, devotion to God that results in a life that is pleasing to him. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's easy to memorize. Devotion to God that results in a life that is pleasing to him. Or here's another quote by G. Fernando. He says, godliness is an attitude of reverence and awe in the presence of a majestic God. An attitude of reverence and awe in the presence of a majestic God. One who lives with such an attitude is going to gradually become like the one he